Before it was called Yorkshire, this stretch of northern England belonged to no single people for long. The land itself was old, carved by ice into wide dales and windswept moors, drained by rivers that would one day carry Roman ships, Viking longboats, and industrial barges alike. Even today, that ancient geography still shapes the county, dividing it into rugged uplands, fertile lowlands, and a long stretch of coastline facing the North Sea. The Brigantes held it first, a Celtic tribe whose kingdom was the largest in Britain when the Romans arrived in the 1st century AD. Governed for a time by a queen, Cartimandua, the Brigantes controlled most of what is now northern England. Her alliance with Rome bought her people decades of peace, though it came at the cost of her own reputation, especially after she handed a fellow British resistance leader over to Roman custody. That peace, however, could not last forever, and Rome's patience with an unstable frontier eventually ran out entirely. By 71 AD, Roman legions marched into stay. They built a fortress at a bend in the River Ouse, in a spot they called Eboracum, likely from a British word for the yew tree, a name that would echo, centuries later, in the modern city of York. Eboracum grew from a timber marching camp into a proper stone fortress, and around it, a bustling civilian town sprang up, tradesmen, brewers, and families drawn by the opportunities a Roman garrison always created. In time, it became the effective capital of Rome's entire northern frontier, so important that emperors themselves traveled here in person to direct their campaigns. Septimius Severus arrived in 208 to campaign against Scotland. Instead, he fell ill and died in Eboracum in the year 211, the imperial court in mourning on the edge of the known world. Nearly a century later, in 306, another emperor, Constantius, died in that same fortress. His son, a young officer named Constantine, was there beside him. The soldiers of Eboracum did not wait for Rome's official approval. In the old Germanic tradition, they raised Constantine onto a shield and declared him emperor, right there, hundreds of miles from Rome, setting in motion nearly 2 decades of civil war before he would finally rule the entire empire alone. It's a strange thought. The man who would legalize Christianity across the Roman Empire, reshaping the ancient world, began his reign not in Rome, but in a garrison fortress in what is now Yorkshire. When Rome's grip on Britain finally faded in the 5th century, Germanic settlers called the Angles moved in, gradually absorbing and intermarrying with the Britons who remained. Eboracum became Eboracum, and the surrounding land became the heart of a new kingdom, Northumbria, eventually one of the most powerful kingdoms in early medieval Britain. This was a genuine golden age, one that complicates the old idea of the Dark Ages almost entirely. Northumbria produced the breathtaking Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of astonishing artistic ambition, and the scholar monk Bede, whose careful, methodical writings remain one of our best windows into early English history to this very day. Eboracum itself became a center of learning that rivaled anywhere in Western Europe. Its cathedral school attracted students from across the continent. A scholar named Alcuin, educated right here, went on to become the leading intellectual advisor at the court of Charlemagne himself, a Yorkshire education, in effect, shaping the intellectual life of an entire continent. Then came the Vikings. In 866, a Norse army captured the city and renamed it Jorvik. For nearly a century, it was the capital of an independent Viking kingdom, ruled by colorful figures like Eric Bloodaxe, and trading with Dublin, Scandinavia, and lands far beyond. Merchants carrying Baltic amber, distant silk, and locally minted silver coins through its busy streets. Archaeologists digging beneath modern York in the 1970s, at a site called Coppergate, found this Viking world remarkably preserved. Waterlogged soil had protected leather shoes still shaped by the feet that wore them, wooden combs, entire timber houses, even preserved insects that let scientists reconstruct what the streets of Jorvik actually smelled like 1,000 years ago. Yorkshire's identity was forged right here, in the collision between Anglian and Norse culture. Hundreds of town names ending in by and Thorpe are Viking words that never left the land. The kingdom of Jorvik ended in 954, folded into a unified England. But Yorkshire's habit of standing apart from the rest of the country was only just beginning. When William the Conqueror took the English throne in 1066, The North resisted him longer and harder than anywhere else. His answer was devastating. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, William's forces swept across Yorkshire in what's now called the Harrying of the North, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and destroying seed grain to make sure rebellion could never take root here again. By some contemporary accounts, tens of thousands died from the famine and exposure that followed in the months after. It was one of the most brutal episodes of the entire Norman conquest. The Domesday Book, William's great survey of his kingdom, compiled some 17 years later in 1086, still records village after Yorkshire village with a single grim Latin word: waste, land so devastated it produced no revenue at all. Out of that devastation came something unexpected. Norman lords poured money into rebuilding, and Yorkshire became home to some of the richest monasteries in Europe: Fountains Abbey, Revo, Viking Jorviks. Cistercian monks built these vast, austere abbeys across the Dales and ran sheep farms on a massive scale. Operations so large, they essentially invented England's wool export trade. Fountains Abbey alone, at its wealthiest, is thought to have run flocks numbering in the tens of thousands of sheep. For 2 centuries, wool grown on Yorkshire hillsides clothed much of medieval Europe, sold to merchants in Italy and Flanders through trading networks that stretched across the entire continent. Italian bankers even advanced money to Yorkshire abbeys years in advance, against future wool shipments, a medieval version of modern commodity trading. By the late Middle Ages, Yorkshire had grown so large it needed dividing. It was split into 3 ridings: north, east, and west, an old Viking word meaning a third part. This wasn't just a line on a map. It shaped how Yorkshire people saw themselves, less as one county, and more as an entire country in miniature, each riding with its own character. Yorkshire's darkest political chapter came in the 1450s and 60s, when it became the main battleground of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster for the English crown. At Towton, near York, on a snowy Palm Sunday in 1461, the 2 armies met in what's often called the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Wind drove snow directly into the faces of the Lancastrian archers, blunting their arrows, while the Yorkist volleys found their mark with far greater ease. Fighting raged for hours in that blinding storm. By nightfall, somewhere between 20 and 28,000 men lay dead, a staggering toll, even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, and modern excavations of mass graves at the site still show the horrific violence of that single afternoon. Ironically, the House of York's real power base was never in Yorkshire itself, but the name stuck to the war, and the White Rose became the county's enduring emblem. Centuries later, Yorkshire transformed again, this time through the Industrial Revolution. The West Riding became one of the true engines of the world economy. Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, and Halifax exploded from quiet market towns into major industrial cities almost overnight. Bradford became the wool processing capital of the entire planet, earning the nickname Worstodopolis. Sheffield became synonymous with steel. Its furnaces produced cutlery and tools that were shipped everywhere the British Empire reached, stamped proudly with the city's name as a mark of quality. It was a hard, transformative century. Canals and railways cut through the Dales, connecting once isolated towns to the wider world. Coal was hauled from pits across South Yorkshire in ever greater quantities, and hundreds of thousands of workers crowded into new industrial towns, drawn by the promise of wages even when conditions inside the mills and factories were often grim and dangerous. Conditions were often grim, and reformers spent decades fighting to improve them. But this era also produced enormous cultural energy. The Brontë sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, wrote their novels from a quiet stone parsonage in Haworth, on the edge of the wild Pennine moors. That windswept, dramatic landscape shaped their stories as much as any character in them, giving the world Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. Yorkshire became, in the popular imagination, a place of striking contrasts. Smoke-blackened mill towns just a few miles from empty, windswept moorland, industry and wilderness sitting almost side by side. The 20th century brought 2 world wars that hit Yorkshire's mining and industrial towns especially hard, sending generations of young men off to fight, and later, keeping factories running around the clock to supply them. What followed was decades of slow, difficult economic decline as global competition changed everything. The miners' strike of 1984 and 85 was fought as fiercely and bitterly in Yorkshire's pits as anywhere in Britain, dividing communities and families alike. The colliery closures that followed in the years after reshaped entire towns, leaving lasting scars on the region's economy and identity. But Yorkshire has spent the decades since, reinventing itself once again, just as it always has. Leeds rose as a major financial and legal hub, its skyline now filled with modern office towers. Sheffield rebuilt itself around advanced technology, engineering, and its thriving universities. York, meanwhile, found new life in tourism, built on the very Roman, Viking, and medieval history that shaped the city in the very first place. Its ancient walls and towering minster now welcome millions of visitors every single year. Yorkshire has been, across 2,000 years, a Roman fortress, a Viking capital, a bloody Civil War battlefield, a wool empire, and an industrial powerhouse that helped power the entire world. And through every single one of those transformations, through conquest, devastation, faith, war, and reinvention, it has kept one thing constant: a fierce, unmistakable sense of being, first and always, Yorkshire.